Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. On this podcast, we talk about what else? Energy, power, innovation, and politics. And I'm pleased to welcome back for the third time everyone's favorite green chicken, Doomberg. Welcome back to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Robert, it's either a hat trick or a third time's a charm. I guess we'll have to find out.
Well, I think this is a hat trick. We'll call it a hat trick.
Good.
So let's jump right in. You have just published a piece on Substack announcing that you are quitting Twitter. What's going on? Why are you out on the Twitter business?
Well, first, Robert, thanks again for having me on. And yes, this is the first chance we've had to talk about the piece that we just published called Notes on X. And, as you and I have discussed many times offline, and I've had similar discussions with literally dozens of other authors on Substack who make their living writing on that platform. As we all know, with the new ownership of Twitter now, X, things have changed, especially for Substack authors. When Notes, which is a competitor to Twitter, was rolled out by the Substack team in April of this year, retribution against Substack creators was pretty swift on Twitter. A lot of us were in disbelief in the early days and held out hope that maybe things would get better. As you may recall, in the beginning, you could post a Substack link, but nobody could like or retweet it or comment on it. It was the craziest thing.
Right.
That was lifted, but what hasn't been lifted is a complete deboosting of any and all things to do with Substack and the platform.
Right.
As we quoted in the piece, we as an experiment, we recently published a link to our most recent piece, and such a tweet would have gotten several hundred or even 1,000 likes last year, and it got 14 likes over a period of a week and a half. And when you're in a relationship and the other side changes, you first try to make it work, and then eventually you have to overcome what we called in the piece sunk cost fallacy. And even though we have an account ostensibly with more than 250,000 followers, we're a very small team. Our time has to be prioritized for maximum impact. We have decided to stay lean. We don't have a separate social media team or anything like that. I do all of the tweeting and writing, and our editor does a lot of the operations, and we've kept everything very, very tight knit. And we believe that's part of our secret sauce. And so when you do that, you have to prioritize.
Right.
And 4 or 5 months later, nothing has really changed. The return on investment for us was very low. And I think it's the same for many other Substack authors. And everyone is in limbo and wondering what to do. And so we decided to tell the world that we're going to spend our time on Notes, which is Substack's competitive product offering. The old saying is dance with the one that brought you. And we built this business in partnership with Substack. They've only ever been amazing, collaborative, working hard to make sure that our success was realized so that their success could be realized. It was a true partnership. They're stand-up people. We've gotten to know everyone from the CEO on down to individual developers as we have collaborated with them to try to make their platform better in a symbiotic relationship that is truly a win-win. And there comes a time in life where, to everything there is a season. We have found that our time on Twitter has become more bitter, the trolls more prominent, the impact smaller, and life's too short. And so we've got a big enough business, and if this hurts our business, so be it. I will miss many aspects of Twitter. We outlined some of them in the piece and how our audience could help us in that regard, but by and large, we won't miss the negativity that the algorithm puts in our face, the time wasted allowing that algorithm to make us angry or upset or to engage with trolls and so on. And Notes is a bit of a more civilized place, at least in the early days, and we're going to make a go of it.
Well, it's an interesting and unfortunate, interesting, yes, but more unfortunate than interesting. I mean, that this platform, which has been a kind of a town square, right, for many years and open, I think especially journalists pay a lot of attention to it. And of course that I'm on Twitter still, but I've noticed the same thing. My links to Substack articles get throttled. I wrote a recent piece on Ford and electric vehicles, tried to post it, wouldn't post. I looked for it after I posted it, wouldn't show up. I mean, it was clear that this was a strategy, and why isn't then Elon Musk say who is doing this, right? Well, why aren't you doing the same thing the New York Times, the Washington Post, or any other media outlet in the world? Instead, it's Substack. So I don't know. I think maybe it speaks to, and I'm like you, I'm all in on Substack. I just find after 30 years in the journalism business that the ability to publish what I want, when I want, how I want is key, and incredibly rewarding. But enough of my editorializing here. What does this say, though, about the modern media business? Because I see it being more and more atomized, right? More and more platforms, more people segregating. But Substack seems to be growing more robust. I mean, handicap how you see some legacy media outlets versus some of the newcomers, including Substack, although you're biased, of course. But I mean, give me your kind of how you see things and how they've changed just in the last 18 months or so.
The thing I like about Substack is thus far, and this could always change, and if it does change, we'd have to reconsider. They seem to be consistently for freedom of speech. And on Substack, you have the Robert Bryces and the Doombergs, alongside environmentalists and global warming alarmists, and pick your favorite members of the opposite side of the scientific and political spectrum that you and I might occupy today. And that's all right. I mean, I think that's perfectly fine. And I think Substack has thus far stood behind its authors, who, of course, still must adhere to their terms of service. And we keep a close eye on our comments section. And we have deleted a few obnoxious comments that we think go outside the bounds of the discourse we would like to see associated with our brand. And we unfortunately had to block a user or two, but nothing compared to Twitter, of course. I mean, barely a day goes by where you don't have to block a dozen people for saying just the most outrageous or nasty or hurtful things. And that just comes with the territory, of course, of being online. And I like to joke to the members of our team who sometimes get upset when people attack us. Is if you spend enough time on the internet looking for somebody saying bad things about you, you will find them. And it's best to just ignore that and move on. And the ultimate ignoring and moving on for us is I look forward to getting my mind share back. I look forward to spending my time interacting with our subscribers. I think we are big enough that we can get everything we need from the amazing, brilliant, we have 175,000 email subscribers. If we can't crowdsource article ideas or find experts to bounce things off of from that crowd, shame on us. Right. And the real deciding factor for us was we both know that an email is way more valuable than a Twitter follow.
Sure.
It's a more intimate form of relationship and a commitment when somebody gives you their email that you won't abuse it and so on. We had 258,000 followers on Twitter and 175,000 emails on Substack. Would we trade that email list for 1 million Twitter followers? No. 2 million Twitter followers? Doubtful.
Right.
So what are we doing? We have this asset. We've earned those emails through the reciprocal relationship that we have created with our audience. And then the final thing I would say is that this aligns our incentives. And so we are going to gamble that audience-led growth will be sufficient to create a business that we will be happy with. And this aligns the incentives. If we continue to delight our readers and occasionally ask them to help us grow, if we have accomplished the task of delighting them, they are likely to respond in kind. And that's far better than trying to please or even trick an algorithm that is programmed against you. Right. And again, we have a finite number of days left on this planet. We intend to live every single one of them to the maximum. And every hour we spent trying to figure out how to make Twitter what it once was is wasted. It's never going back to the way it was. And that's sad, but that's okay. You mourn loss, and you go through the 5 stages and you get over it. And we are forward looking. We're excited at the prospect of focusing all of our energy on one website with a team that has been nothing but supportive of them. And if Substack succeeds, and I should say, full disclosure, we invested in the author-led round. We are now equity owners in Substack, however small our position might be. I don't want people to think we're talking our book. That was not an input into why we left Twitter, but it certainly weighed on where we decided to go, logically so. We're all in on Substack. We put our money where our mouth is. We invested in that author round. And we're going to make a go of it with the team that, we're going to dance with the one that brought us, Robert. That's sure. All I can say.
Well, that line I think is variously attributed, but to one is to Darrell Royal, the former University of Texas football coach, right? Who was asked, I think, one time why he was always his team always ran the ball, and then he said, "Well, you dance with the one who brung you." And a
It shows the difference in our cultural background. I first heard it from Shania Twain.
Oh, Shania. Okay. Well, I think Darrell Royal predates Shania. So anyway, yeah, that in fact there was an Austin band by my friend Dan Hardick called the Who Brung Yas, in tribute to Darrell Royal. So just as a little bit of
I guess
trivia.
I must be measurably younger than you. What can I say?
Well, um, yeah, maybe so. So, but is this? I want to ask that question again because we've talked so many times offline as well. But you mentioned once that the riches are in the niches, and with 175,000 email subscribers, and not all of them paid, of course, but you're reaching an audience that what would be in what I would think about in the old days would be a sizable or a medium-sized newspaper in America, right? So you have considerable reach. And is this the inevitable, to feed on that question or that comment, is this the inevitable result of where media is going, that these niches are going to be where the riches are, that this atomization that's happened, this segmentation of the marketplace, whether it's streaming video or news related outlets, is that it seems like to me that's what I see, just this continuing segregation, which is ongoing. Does that rhyme with you? Does that seem like that? Does that seem am I in the right ballpark here and thinking about
Yeah.
what the trend is?
I agree with the trend, but perhaps we have a different opinion as to its genesis.
Okay.
So I would say you and I in Substack are taking advantage of an inefficiency in the market that is a combination of the media dropping the ball on serving the public and becoming what I would say is sort of overtly partisan in the ugly team sports, the politics of team sports, your side, my side, and the media's job, of course, is to agnostically report on the news, not to pick sides and to shape narratives to try to bend the political support of one party over the other. And I do think that had the media not become so overtly partisan, I don't think this inefficiency would have opened up. It's been made worse, of course, by Google and Facebook undercutting and kneecapping the revenue models of the media sector, which forced them to sort of to go into sort of more clickbaity and everything is a news alert and the weather maps are redder now to try to get everybody more afraid.
Right.
And so, but I do think that as a consequence of that, there is an opportunity for independent citizen journalists, and we are not professional journalists, you are, but we try to be professional in our journalism, and I think that's an important distinction to make. And we have earned the credibility of our supporters through hard work, showing our homework, good writing, good editing, good photoshopping, a little bit of humor, teaching people stuff they didn't know, reframing the news of the day in a different light. And that's the reason why we went for the subscriber model. The advertising model is a whole different ballgame. And I do think that being 100% subscriber supported allows us the flexibility to be, provocative without being polarizing and to write about all manner of topics that would be taboo in modern journalism. Imagine trying to get an article critical of the proposed solutions to the so-called climate crisis printed in the Washington Post and the New York Times today. Maybe an editorial if you're lucky, but certainly not an article.
Right.
And so if
let me follow up on that, because I think that's the key here is, and you use that word narrative. And I was talking with my friend and publisher, former publisher, Peter Osnos, who founded Public Affairs Books, where I published all 6 of my books. And there was a recent article, and he wrote for the Washington Post for many years. And there was a recent article in the Washington Post that I thought was just ridiculous, right? And it was about land use conflicts and renewables, which is something I've been reporting on for a dozen years. And it just inflamed me. And so I called Peter and I said, what do you do about this? What should I do? And he said, ignore it. Right. And he said, this is the narrative. And that was the word that he used as well. And I think that's the story. The narrative is the story, right? With the media, these legacy media outlets, I think, and particularly the Post, National Public Radio, New York Times, would have been the traditional elite East Coast publications, that they have a narrative that they're continually selling, particularly around energy and climate, power, that all of these are part of this kind of nexus of worldview that is excluding other voices, that I think is I'm reflecting back on what you said, that excluding other voices, or excluding even what I think would be even-handed reporting, which this post-port piece did not have, that's driving, I think, people to seek out individual writers who they say, I trust that person, and I'm going to subscribe to that person because I trust that person or that team, in your case, with the green chicken. And that's my quick observation, because I think that word narrative is really important.
And I would say that goes both ways. We will never get trapped in never admitting, for example, that we got something wrong, or bringing to our audience an opinion that we think most of them might disagree with, but doing it from a framework of intellectual honesty.
Yeah.
So, for example, there were times where I felt it was important to recognize that the Gavin Newsom was making correct moves on nuclear power, or when East Palestine, more famously, was being hyped up on Fox News as being a catastrophic event for the entire continent of North America. People on Twitter were talking about how people in Mississippi, downriver from Ohio, ought to be buying bottled water. We stepped up and wrote a free piece called Railroaded, where we systematically went through what was in each of those rail cars, and correctly, in hindsight, indicated that this was a local tragedy, a regional event, and a national nothing burger. And because it was in the moment being used to bludgeon President Joe Biden, some of our audience were upset with the way that we framed that. It was inconsistent, for example, with how Sean Hannity and Waters were just pounding away at Biden day and night, and the transportation secretary as well. We wrote an intellectually honest piece. We stood by our principles. We had dozens and dozens of people from the region reach out to us and thank us for writing that piece. We had one fella reach out to us who was 60 miles upwind and upriver away from the event, and was wondering whether he should move. And God bless him. I was like, I can't tell you what to do,
right.
But if it was me, I wouldn't be moving.
Right.
And so if you're intellectually honest, if you try to have it, the way that I would use it is much better to be ideological than partisan. We have a set of ideologies that we believe, that we stay consistent with, and we won't change them just because the potential opponent politically has adopted one of our positions, or if our potential, theoretical political ally has taken a position against us.
Right.
So, for example, many of our readers might support Kennedy, let's say.
Right.
His position on nuclear power, in our view, disqualifies him for the presidency. I don't care what his other positions are. That is a make or break position for us, and anybody reading Doomberg would know that. And we're not going to shy away from saying that if he becomes a serious candidate for office. So I think it's okay to be ideological. I think partisanship is a real stain on our society.
Well, I like the way you put that too. I like that better to be ideological than partisan, because yes, you have to have some belief system, a view of the world, how you see things, right? Your ideology about and understanding of it and rationality about it. But let's move on. So we've talked about media, and I don't want to spend this whole hour on just talking about media. I want to talk about, how you're interpreting the world and particularly recent events. You did a presentation recently on, you called it doom scrolling. And one of the things was the fiscal cliff. And this year, as you know, the national debt will hit 1 trillion. Payments on the national debt will hit $1 trillion per year. Our payments on the national debt will exceed the amount of money we're spending on national defense. I've been watching this debt thing for a long time, and this seems really worrisome. And there are some people are dismiss it. But dismiss it or not, it's very clear that the politicians in Washington are not going to rein in spending. They didn't do it under Trump. They're not doing it now. The spending continues apace. Here's the question. How worried should we be about this enormous amount of money, the debt, now $32 trillion, I think, that the federal government is racking up? How concerned should we be?
So just to frame it for your audience, this is a presentation that we gave our monthly Doom Zoom to our pro tier, who are our higher level subscribers. And I shared that with you in advance because there's some interesting things in there. And the title was Doom Scrolling. The subtitle was Searching the Globe for Things to Worry About, which is a fun thing for us to do. And in fact, it's worse than that. It's We're about to cross 1 trillion in interest payments on the debt. Not
Well,
debt
did I
payments.
misspeak?
Yes.
I meant
Yeah.
that was what I meant to say. The national debt is
Well,
32 trillion. The interest
yeah,
payments are $1 trillion. Will hit $1 trillion per
it's
year
an
annualized
incredible
this year.
number.
Yeah.
If you think about it, our national debt crossed $1 trillion at the end of the Carter administration. And the first federal budget that surpassed $1 trillion was in the Reagan administration. And now we're spending $1 trillion a year on interest, on the way to much higher.
Yeah.
And if you just do back of the envelope, look, I understand, there's duration in the debt portfolio, and not all bonds are coming due and need to be refinanced. But just as a back of the envelope, 5.5% interest times $32 trillion is 1.8 billion a year theoretically. In interest
1.8 trillion.
1.8 trillion a year.
We're both getting our units wrong here. So
well, what's 3 more zeros between friends at this point? I mean,
three orders, just 3 orders of magnitude, right? So 32 trillion in debt, $1 trillion a year in interest payments alone on the debt, and if we're financing that at 5.5% interest, that's $1.8 trillion a year just on the debt repayment. So
just on the interest payments,
and the interest payments, right?
Here's the scary part. To your question, those interest rate increases, in fact, may be inflationary. So Jerome Powell, of course, is raising interest rates in the hopes of breaking the back of inflation. But in reality, those interest payments go to the investor class. And as our friend Luke Groman calls them, they're a form of fiscal stimmies for the rich. That money is being spent. Now, of course, the velocity of that money is different than giving, $10,000 per household, printing cash, universal basic income style. But it is still $1 trillion going into the economy. And then you layer on top of that the increased cost of capital for the oil producers, which is an inflationary pulse. And you could begin to wonder whether, in fact, raising these rates will, in fact, spur inflation in a second wave here coming up soon. And then the other thing that is amazing is our entitlements that we've promised people.
Right.
Many of them are in the form of services, not actual money. Medicaid, pick your favorite, veterans benefits. And then even Social Security, of course, is indexed to inflation. And so you can see an entitlement doom loop on top of a debt doom loop, getting to the point where we dive off what's known as the fiscal cliff. And one of the things that we are pondering is whether we have just become so numb to the outright fraud, corruption, waste, and mismanagement that DC has foisted upon the rest of the country, that we are, quote unquote, retreating to the quiet of our personal gardens, in the hopes that this will all just somehow magically get better. Could you imagine 10, 15 years ago, the rampant insider trading we see in Washington, D.C., or the outright corruption? I mean, cocaine in the White House, Robert. The Secret Service has no idea who did it. Wink, wink. It's insane where we've come. We have, and by the way, this is bipartisan. We had the head of the Senate for the Republicans, Mitch McConnell, freezing at a microphone, and we have another senator from California who's instructed on how to vote because she's clearly not there. It feels like end of Rome, banana republic type stuff. It truly does. And so if you're going to go around the world looking for stuff to be worried about, we think the U.S. fiscal situation is certainly one of them.
When you say fiscal cliff, what do you mean?
Where the marginal buyer of the debt and payer of interest is the government itself through printing.
So that to service the debt, the government just has to keep printing more money, and then
this is
a never-ending inflationary cycle.
Emerging, what we would typically assign to an emerging economy that has dollar-denominated debts that it can't service, and you have this hyperinflationary spiral. I know anytime you use that word, lots of people on Twitter, which I won't have to worry about anymore, like to attack you for using it. But you tell me, who's going to be buying 1.8 trillion a year in interest payments, let alone the mountain of debt that we have to service? I saw that we have $1 trillion of new debt to issue between now and the end of the year, I think it is. Who's buying that at some point? It's pretty amazing. Did you believe for a second that any of this debt is going to be paid back through economic growth?
Well, let's go to that then, because that's the other part of this that, so the other word that pops into my mind is Zimbabwe, right?
Mm-hmm.
Suddenly we're Zimbabwe and we're printing $1 trillion currency notes that, or whatever, name your number, $1,000 currency notes because or the inflation is so out of hand. But talk about that in terms of the recession. There was an article on the front page of the Wall Street Journal just yesterday, the day before, saying, well, this recession everybody's talking about looks like a soft landing. So is it possible that all this spending under the Inflation Reduction Act, which I also want to talk about, that this is stimulating the economy and economic growth enough that it's staving off this inevitable economic doom loop? How do you see the resilience of the apparent resilience of the U.S. economy right now? I'd say I had Peter St. Onge on the podcast a while back, and he's saying it's all illusion, that there are serious problems afoot. But how do you read it?
Probably somewhere in between. I think there are real pockets of strength, especially with the onshoring and nearshoring movement. And we're measuring economic activity, and there's a lot of activity going on right now as we ponder the weaknesses that we have inflicted upon ourselves vis-a-vis China and reliance on them for key elements of our defense supply chains and manufacturing supply chains. And so I think there's no question that some of that is real, but then you get back to inflation and how high do interest rates need to go and for how long do they need to stay there, and what does that do for the U.S. fiscal situation? Yeah. It's a real catch-22. At its core, we have never raised interest rates this fast with this much debt, and that's the difference between now and the Volcker era, for example. Debt as a percent of GDP is several times higher than it was back then. And the second order effect of raising those interest rates, i.e. fiscal stimulus for the investor class, and we're all investors really, pensioners, pick your favorite, the union employees that have a significant pension. I mean, they're all, one way or the other getting those stimmies. Now, again, the velocity of that money is smaller than if you just handed out cash to people, but it's not zero. And sure. And I think it may have been overlooked. So you have, again, $1 trillion in interest payments is finding its way into the economy, just as we're uncorking a fire hose of cash into the renewable sector, just as we are onshoring as quickly as we can critical materials and supply chain elements. So you can make a case that the U.S. will have pretty impressive nominal GDP growth, but at the same time, you could have a fiscal spiral.
So, well, right. Okay. So let's talk about one of the things you just mentioned there, China. I've been intrigued. I had a guest on the podcast recently, Arjun Murthy, who's a former Goldman Sachs guy and super smart, really enjoyable conversation, very lucid, very concise in his talking about energy and why oil demand and energy demand is going to continue to grow. But he used this great phrase, peak China. There was a headline today or yesterday about slowing growth in China. What happens and Peter Zion has talked about this as well, about the demographics in China being strained, and that the one child policy is going to come back to haunt them. Their economic growth is slowing. What does peak China mean to you? Does that phrase ring true? And what would a slow decline in the Chinese economy mean for the rest of the world?
It is a difficult question, and I would say, any Western analyst that claims to have a magic ball to look into, magic 8 ball to look into China is probably fooling themselves. It's a bit of a black box to outsiders. As many times as I've visited it, I can't claim that I know it well, but I will say this: when I hear the arguments about demographic changes, what people don't point out is, and what I think is the most important number, is the ever-increasing size of the Chinese middle class. So yes, the total population may be peaking and beginning to tumble off, but as more and more of that population emerges into the middle class, that, as you know, means more oil, more coal, more natural gas, more electricity. And there's an inflection point of your BTU used per GDP, right? That famous chart. And the size of the Chinese and the Indian and the Indonesian and the Pakistani middle class is growing. And I think that effect will swamp the sort of, it's the average versus the mean, right? Or the median versus the mean, I guess is a better way to say it. I would say that the parameter that matters most is the size of the consumer population, the size of the people that have tasted our way of life and would like more of it. That matters more than the top-down total average numbers that are being tossed about from the demographics point of view.
So if I'd read that back to you, I'd interpret it this way: that if you have more wealth and more wealthy consumers, or they're getting richer, what are they going to do? They're going to use more energy, and energy is a proxy for GDP, so that continued economic growth and available funding, right, or discretionary money, discretionary spending in all of those countries, Indonesia being the one that has had the most rapid growth in coal consumption. The IEA report on coal just came out recently. That increase in wealth will then stoke GDP, because they're going to be using more energy. They'll be consuming all kinds of things more than they have in the past.
So we put out a piece several weeks ago where we formulated what we call Doomberg's postulate, which goes something like this. Every molecule of fossil fuels produced will be consumed and burned by somebody somewhere. And local restrictions only shift who gets to benefit from the privilege of doing so.
Yeah.
And as we invoke, our climate policies in Western Europe and the US, that just frees up coal, natural gas, and oil for the Indonesias and the Pakistans and the Chinas of the world, which gives them the taste of the lifestyle that we have enjoyed and taken for granted for many decades. And this is why you see record coal production last year, record coal production this year. I just saw a report that we have an all-time record oil demand. We just crossed, the pre-COVID highs.
Right.
And that's going to continue because everybody everywhere wants a higher standard of living, especially those who have tasted it. And so if you have a higher standard of living for a while and then it's taken away from you, what happens? Political upheaval. So the leaders of China probably aren't as worried about the total population. They're probably worried about the growing size of their middle class and how do they best serve them. Because as we both know, if there's one thing that's true about the Chinese Communist Party is they are paranoid about maintaining their grip on power.
Right.
And, I've been to Shanghai, I've been to Beijing, I've been to, the various cities in China. They would remind you of the best parts of the biggest cities in Europe and in the US. They're vibrant, they're full of entrepreneurs, growing really fast, cranes everywhere. Sure, the property market and all those growing pains that many people like to point to, but the size of the middle class in Asia is growing, and I do believe that will swamp the Peter Zeihan hypothesis in the medium term.
So it's not just raw number of people; it's how much money they have and how they're spending it. It'd be another way to think about it.
What is their energy demand? Yeah,
got it. Dethroning the dollar. You talked about this as well. And this has been something that's been a discussion point for, I don't know, ever about how long the dollar is going to remain the reserve currency. Maybe we covered this enough in talking about interest rates and the rest of it. But if the dollar I'll ask it this way. Is the dollar going to be dethroned? I think you quoted Luke Grauman saying this very thing, that it was going to happen. And here it is, that the existing debt-backed monetary system is fundamentally incompatible with peak cheap oil and commodities. So monetary system change is highly likely, coming one way or another, likely sooner than most think.
Yeah, that's Luke's view. We included his along with 4 or 5 others in a piece that we called Something or Nothing, where we did a bit of a deep dive on BRICS and whether or not how real this was, I guess is the way to say it. Our view is the desire to do so is strong and has only been made stronger by our sanctioning of the Russian reserves.
Right.
I think the BRICS will make a go of it. I think it's much harder than people think. I think the U.S. has many tools in its toolbox to fight back, slow, or otherwise dissuade people from going down that path. I think historically, if you take a look, serious attempts in the past have resulted in surprise wars and overthrows of regimes. And there's no question that the Chinese would like to see an alternative to the U.S. dollar system, which is one of the reasons why we are worried about whether or not a kinetic conflict over the Taiwan situation might coincidentally evolve from the BRICS efforts to try and get away from the U.S. dollar. We live and exist in the U.S. dollar system, and we intend to continue to do so. We would like, a better set of policies than we currently have. But and also, of course, we've warned our friends in the gold bug community that if a gold-backed BRICS currency does truly represent a threat to the U.S. dollar hegemony, it is not impossible that the U.S. government might outlaw the private ownership of gold again. And so should be careful what you wish for in this regard. And this is an example of us writing through ideological lenses to an audience that is mostly pro gold and telling them a message that they might not necessarily be happy to hear.
Well, we'll stay away from crypto because that's another set of issues. But you also mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, and you said it will torch taxpayer money in an inferno of corruption. What kind of corruption?
We need look no further than the now infamous 2009 Green Energy Act of Ontario for an example of what is sure to follow, which is all manner of insiders will line their pockets at the expense of the public purse, and nothing good will come of it. Outrage will grow amongst the populace, and governments will be swept out of power, only to be replaced with saner politicians, or at least politicians who are willing to implement saner policies in the hopes of gaining and keeping power, which is the way the system is meant to work. And we wrote all of this in a piece called Cheat Codes, where we talked about how Ontario is basically a decade ahead of the US, and why can't we just skip the in-between? And I should say that piece was motivated by listening to Dr. Chris Kiefer's recent appearance on your wonderful podcast. And since we consume all of the content that you put out, that was a great genesis for Cheat Codes for us. And so get the chance to thank you for putting out that great podcast, because we certainly enjoyed it and we made an article out of it.
Well, and isn't it remarkable? And, I have great admiration for Chris Kiefer. I consider him a good friend. And, that here's this guy, a 6'9" medical doctor who works in the emergency room in Toronto, suddenly becomes the leader. Improbably, he comes out of nowhere and becomes the leader of the pro-nuclear movement in Canada and affects this incredible change in policy in Ontario. So not just that they are refurbishing Pickering, they're going to expand the Bruce Power Station. They're going to build forgot the numbers. I've talked about it, but what multiple gigawatts of new capacity. It's just a truly incredible story, and one that amidst a world where there are so many things to be cynical about, and that, damn, here's one guy, and it's not all due to him, but he had a team, he worked with other people, that right person, right time. But wow, I mean, what an incredible story. So, well, thank you for that acknowledgement, but I'm happy to give credit where credit is due, and that belongs to Dr. Kiefer. I mean, what an amazing story.
And I will say that is in the same way that you and I could carve out our own audiences, Dr. Kiefer has carved out his own following and has used it for the broader good, and good for him. And that is, of course, proof. He is the exception that proves the rule. The rule is that citizen advocacy in our system can still work. It's easy to get cynical and to throw up your hands and say, what does my one voice matter? We started a blog with a green chicken as the front of house, and look at the impact that we've had in our own small way, and look at the impact you've had with your podcast and your Substack. And if more people would get into the arena, we could probably affect more change. And hopefully stories like Dr. Kiefer and the impact that he's had in Canada, and hopefully, we got so many reach outs from US staffers of politicians asking us, hey, can I forward this? Can I share this? Like, this is the story we want to tell internally. And I do think that just like me listening to Dr. Kiefer on your show, people reading our piece, or people listening to you, or a public speaking engagement that you give, like one swing at a time of the axe does the tree fall. And it's certainly not going to fall if you don't swing. And if nothing else, at least you'll get some exercise, And so
that's right. What's the great Wayne Gretzky line? I missed 100% of the shots I never took. That was
our advice to all Substack creators who reach out to us is chop, chop, just keep swinging. And if your axe is sharp enough and you swing hard enough and you're accurate enough in your throws, that the tree will eventually fall down.
So we've talked about China, but I want to just follow up on the Taiwan conflict, because this is something that's been that ever-present thing, right? And the ever-present looming kind of, well, will they or won't they? And if they did, what then happens? And to me, I my simplistic view of geopolitics, I look at it and I think, well, if China did that, well, then they'd be subject to all kinds of sanctions that would result in big effects on their economy. Or are they too big to sanction? I guess that's the flip side of that. So I'm, on the one hand, I'm thinking, well, if they did that, there'd be a significant price to pay that economic and industrial policy. But then on the other hand, maybe they think they're too big and the West can't live without them. So I guess I'm trying to hold those two conflicting thoughts in my own head. Do you weigh one side or the other more heavily? You think a Taiwan invasion is inevitable?
A little more than a week ago, we had what Ben Hunt would describe as a "why are we hearing this now" moment. When Kyle Bass, of all people, who's a famous hedge fund manager with a bit of an expertise in China, was presenting at the Hudson Institute, of all places, on his belief that President Xi Jinping was preparing for war over Taiwan. And I would encourage everybody here to Google, Kyle Bass China War. It's the first thing that comes up. You can watch it. I think it's 45 minutes long. I watched it. We watched it as a team. And he makes a pretty compelling case that the press in the West is, what they're reporting about what President Xi is saying and doing versus what he's actually saying and doing. If you go and read the source documents, that chasm is as wide as can be. And domestically, he is preparing for war, stockpiling food, stockpiling energy, drills, and just the things he is saying. The literal words on the page couldn't be more clear. Now, you could wonder whether that is a preemptive defensive posture under the assumption that he has observed what has happened in Ukraine and would not like a repeat in his neighborhood. That's a hopeful interpretation. Kyle Bass's interpretation is that Xi is preparing for a preemptive offensive strike, which will undoubtedly lead to a kinetic conflict with the U.S. All bets are off in that scenario. That's kind of a singularity event from an economic and really military perspective. I mean, even in Ukraine, it's not like we have, U.S. Soldiers in direct combat with Russian soldiers. It's a bit of a proxy war.
Right.
But I don't know that we could imagine a scenario where a breakout of kinetic conflict between China and Taiwan with the size of the U.S. Navy and what Biden has said about the situation, whether or not that wouldn't quickly devolve into an outright conflict between the Chinese military and the U.S., and then how that could somehow not lead to an exchange of nuclear weapons. It can get pretty scary if you think about it.
It is damn scary. And one of the things that scares me, I mean, not that nuclear war is the second order thing to be scared about, but you mentioned the age of the U.S. leadership. I look at President Biden. I'm not, not taking any joy in saying this, but is this guy really capable of matching wits with Xi or being the commander in chief if we go into a military conflict? And if it's not him, then who's going to call the shots? Is it Kamala Harris? I mean, who's going to be the one that's going to say, yes, we're going to go to war, and then have any kind of strategy that is sensible given the complexities that would inevitably result? I mean, that is deeply scary, and I'm sorry I brought it up because now I'm scared shitless here.
When I read 1984 as a child, which now I wish I had done, it's hard to imagine that the obvious cognitive decline of the president, which is sad, really, has somehow become a partisan issue. Like, I see what I see with my own eyes. Like, you can tell me that this isn't happening. I know what's going on. Everybody knows what's going on. And some people are lying about it. That's basically what it comes down to. And so I don't think that expressing concern about the cognitive decline of the president, which couldn't be more obvious.
Yeah.
Like it's as obvious as 2 + 2 is 4.
I saw it on Jill Biden's face.
Yes,
in the campaign, that there was one time where he got lost and you could see this look. I mean, obviously, controlled, but still the look on her face, like a stricken look, like, oh God.
Well, and
wanting to intervene, but not sure quite how to do it. And then, but we've also had this, we talked about the interest rates and the debt payments on the interest going like this. The one graphic I saw the other day was the average age of the U.S. member of Congress, which was the same, that we've had this incredible and unfortunate increase in the average age of our representatives and our senators. And I don't think that's good for democracy either. We need to turn those people over. We need fresh blood in there. And instead they seem, because is the entrenchment, I'll ask it this way, that entrenchment, is that a reflection of this gerontocracy that's been now so firmly entrenched that they don't want to leave because, might get one or the other side in here if I quit? I mean, is that Is that one of the problems that we have? One of the identifiable problems that we have in terms of our government in DC?
I think most of them are scared of leaving office out of fear of being arrested. I just think that the corruption has reached such on both sides, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what is Mitch McConnell doing? Everybody saw what happened. Again, that's not a partisan issue. You
Yeah.
can observe what happened with Mitch McConnell at that infamous press conference and say, it's probably time the man hung it up.
Yeah.
Right.
And the same with Dianne Feinstein. Yeah.
Dianne Feinstein, like she is not there. She's just not there.
So who's doing the voting? Who's deciding? Or is it the party bosses that are saying, this is what we want, tell her to vote this way. And then the aide pushes the button or does whatever it is. Well, that's not the way it's supposed to work. And correct. This is from one of the most powerful, the most populous and arguably the state with the biggest GDP in America, from California. So it just reflects a deeply,
look, say what you want about Joe Manchin. Joe Manchin is a lucid, well-read, ideological politician who has taken stances on various issues. And if you had dinner with the man, you would know that he would be able to coherently articulate his platform and the basis for it, and would be open-minded and all the things you would expect from a politician that we used to have from politicians. And, it's really amazing to see. Like, it can't be that Donald Trump and Joe Biden are the two very best people that we have to choose from for the next president. Again, I'm sure I'm going to annoy many people on both sides of the aisle by saying that. I didn't vote for either.
You can say it again. They're both octogenarians. Right? We don't have anyone else here in the whole country that.
I mean, I didn't vote for either of them. I'm not ashamed to say it. And I think that we deserve better. I hear that Hillary Clinton is considering running again. I mean, my God. I mean, enough already. Like, can't we just? Is there no fresh blood? Is there no new ideas? Is there not yet a new generation? And the longer this generation hangs on, the worse I think the political revolution will be.
Well, and that's one of the things that makes Robert Kennedy Jr., I mean, I think scary. I agree with you. I mean, his position on the Indian Point closure was just ridiculous, and he should apologize for it and reverse course. I don't expect that to happen. But the one thing that makes it interesting, right, that the horse race of American politics that happens every 4 years is that he's saying things, doing things that people like him aren't supposed to do, right, and calling things out. And he's only gotten this much traction, of course, because of his famous last name, but still, at least we're not bored.
Yeah, look, I would much rather see DeSantis versus Newsom. At least you have, two
relatively young, big state governors that are
executive experience,
clear
opposite ends of
clear ideological stances that, but yeah, that would be refreshing, would it? And that really would. I like that idea.
I mean, again, you could choose to vote for either or neither, but at least it's an injection of executive experience. Yeah. Say what you want. California's been run a certain way. Florida's been run a certain way. You let the numbers speak for themselves. They both have policies that many listeners would find highly objectionable. That's politics. And so at least it would be a reasonable choice. But in fact, in my ideal election, you would have Newsom running against DeSantis, running against Joe Manchin as an independent. And then we could have a choice across the political spectrum, left, right, and center. And maybe we might end up with some kind of a coalition government that makes some real compromises for the good of the people going forward. Not to get too political.
The Manchin as a dark horse is really quite intriguing. So let's forget about those people for a few minutes. Let's talk about Russia. You mentioned in your presentation on doom scrolling the Russian conflict and the Ukraine situation. And it's been this gradual escalation all along. And now the provision of cluster bombs to the Ukrainian side and the ever increasing amount of money. I think you said it was now $75 billion in direct military aid from the U.S. alone into Ukraine. And neither side seems to be making much headway. Neither side seems to be willing to compromise. I don't see why Putin at this point would compromise, because he's in a situation, I think, where if he goes down fast and hard and maybe with a bullet in his head. Russian politics is opaque, but nevertheless it's not and opaque and not pretty. What's your view on what happens next with Russia, and how do you think about the conflict and how it might end?
How does it end? That's the great question. Like, what is the path out?
Yeah.
We're not leaving either side of a reasonable path out. Um,
And meanwhile, the grain market is being dramatically
correct,
upset,
but
right?
also, in our view, that is more opportunities for inadvertent conflict escalation. I think that is the impact of the collapse of the Black Sea grain deal than the actual impact on global food supplies, because I do think that grain will find its way to the market just like the oil and gas and coal does today. But it does set up for confrontation at sea that perhaps was not there as people try to bust the sanctions and so on. It is a scary situation, and I would say that I'm unabashedly anti-war and pro-peace, and I'm old enough to remember then when that would get you labeled with the unpatriotic liberal crowd.
right.
And today, somehow that makes you an alt-right pro-Putin puppet. I'm the father of draft-age children. I would, if we are going to enter into a war, I would at least like a vote in Congress and have my representative go on the record, yay or nay, as to why it is that we're going to war. We've not done that. We've normalized the usurpation of congressional authority by the executive branch of government, and entangling ourselves in all manner of foreign affairs that the average U.S. citizen couldn't care less about. And that's not being unpatriotic. That's just my view. I think that the use of the U.S. military is something that Congress should approve of.
And that's a key insight that you use the right word, the usurpation of the congressional authority by the executive, and that's exactly what's happened. That there's been,
and Congress is just as much to blame as the executive office. I mean, this used to be when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt went to Congress and asked for a declaration of war.
Right.
Of course, he got it, and there was no chance that he wouldn't. But at least, your local representative went on record and said, yes, in my view, this is worthy of spending the blood and treasure of the United States in response to this unprovoked attack. Here, what we have is a drip, drip, drip. No one authorization being big enough to really matter, but the integral of all of those drips is the functional equivalence of war.
Slow escalation of a proxy war, and with no clear sense of how it might de-escalate or end, either one. But you mentioned that the oil issue, and one of the other things that's interesting to me in terms of that global market is that for all of these talks about sanctions and the rest of it, that Russian oil is getting to market, right? With this, this idea we're going to stop the Russians from selling their oil, or we're going to dictate a certain price. Oh, no more than $64.32. And beyond that, no, that's too much. It was always destined. It was always destined to fail, and it's failed already. So that part seems a clear failure. Am I misreading things?
We've never been more right more quickly on something more important than our view, which we expressed in the earliest days of the sanctions policy, that this was as foolhardy a set of policies as one could implement. Anybody with 5 minutes worth of experience in the commodity sector knows that you cannot disrupt somebody's revenue by trying to sanction their volume. The only way to disrupt somebody's revenue is to flood the market and destroy price. And by trying to keep the Russian volume off the international markets, we only assured that the prices would stay higher for longer and that Putin would get more money to fund his war machine. We said this when it was unpopular. We got ridiculed. It's turned out to be 100% true, as we knew it had to be because of our own experience in the commodity sector, hard learned over decades. And the thought experiment is simple enough. Imagine if we had been successful in blocking half of Putin's oil from coming to the markets. So instead of 10 million barrels, let's say it's 5. The price of oil would have way more than doubled.
Right.
And he would have gotten more revenue on half volume. This is just a fundamental truism. Back when we went in our first adventure in Iraq, what did we do? We flew around the world. James Baker, the Velvet Hammer, made sure that all of the major oil producers opened up the throttle, pumped full speed ahead, flooded the world with oil, kept the price of oil under control, because that administration understood that you have to flood the market to keep prices low. And anybody who's ever worked in commodities knows that if you have a tight commodity and your competitor or even your own plant blows up, if you have multiple other plants, you're going to make it up in volumes.
Right.
Like you're going to mint money when inelastic commodities go short. So if we had been successful, which we would never have been, because all it does is line the pockets of the various black market participants who move, this quote unquote dirty oil
Right.
from those who produce it to those who need it. In reality, it was never going to work in the first place. It hasn't worked, and it's a true policy failure. And we take pride in the fact that we called that early and stand by that call.
What do you think has been, you've made these calls and you're now the most successful or the top earning finance publication on Substack. Congratulations on that. What,
Thank you.
If you had to, are there a couple of things or three things that you'd say have made you successful?
When we're wrong, we admit it. So we thought Jerome Powell was finished. He clearly wasn't. He got reappointed. We thought that Putin would never invade, and he did. We got that wrong. I think anybody in this content creation world who makes as many calls as you do or I do, you're going to get a lot of them wrong. And if you try to hide that fact, again, the worst case scenario risk did not evolve in Europe, thankfully, in the last winter, which many had assumed that we were cheering for, when in fact, no matter how many times we said it, we would prefer not to see shivering Germans in December and January because they've run out of energy. We are desperately trying to ring the bell to get ahead of such scenarios. When you get something wrong, I think it's okay to go back and to admit it and to learn from it and to try to do better. I think we write from an authentic ideological viewpoint. We have a consistent lens. And I think another thing, like this recent room temperature superconductor news, I'm not sure how close you're following that.
Yeah.
We wrote a piece where instead of just giving our views, we shared with our readers our framework for how we came to those views. Here are the 5 questions we ask anytime a news item like this hits the tape. And we are, requested by, back in the day, our CEO, or now our subscribers. Like, what does this mean? Should we be worried about it? How should we position our company given this news event? We have a very simple framework for such situations. We shared that framework with our readers, and then we systematically went through that and came to our conclusion and said, by the way, we hope we're wrong. We are deeply skeptical about the superconducting breakthrough. But if you put it to me today, if this thing unravels in an unfortunate scientific misconduct event, or it turns out to be true and our skepticism was proven to be incorrect, we would much rather the latter.
Sure. Because
the development of room temperature superconductors would be a fantastic thing for society, for humanity, for the economy. It would be a true breakthrough that matters. And this phrase "holy grail" is often overused, but this would be a true holy grail. Like, this is a giant leap forward in technology if it proves to be true. And even though we had to make a call, and we told our subscribers using our framework, we would be deeply skeptical of this, we will be the first to write a celebratory piece admitting that we were wrong. And I think that intellectual honesty and that consistency to your ideology in the era of media partisanship and games of gotcha is something that we will never sway from. It is certainly the root cause of any success we've been privileged enough to enjoy.
Right. Well, and I think you talked about it in terms of your brand, and if I remember, your brand, your brand ambition is to instill or to elicit excitement and pleasure in your clients, and that's your brand ambition.
Yeah,
I'm remembering that
when our piece lands in our ideal client's inbox, they say to themselves, their gut feeling is, "Ooh, I get to read that."
Yeah,
that's the brand, and that's what we hope to do. And the only way to do that is to delight them. And I think we've tried hard to carve out intellectual honesty and rigor, showing our homework. Here's the links right. With each piece.
Yeah. Just a couple more things because we're coming close to an hour, and my guest is, of course, the famous, everyone's favorite green chicken. I don't know if you have any favorite yellow or blue or orange chickens, but the favorite green chicken in any case, of course, you can find him doomberg.substack.com and the Doomberg team, rather. We've both been critical of the wind industry, proudly so. I don't like them. They don't like me back. I'm okay with that. But you have a chart in your doom scrolling, the collapse in the share price of Siemens Energy, numerous collapses of these big structures onshore. The structures offshore are getting bigger and bigger. You point out that they are failing due to stress because they are getting so big. Are they reaching the limits of have always been operating at the Betz limit, right? Which is the theoretical efficiency that you can get from a fluid, right? What does this indicate? Does this presage the slow decline of the wind industry? How do you, what cast this forward for me in terms of how you see this playing out?
Again, another series of ideas that I gleaned from listening to Chris Kiefer's podcast, Decouple. He had a guest on with significant wind experience that really framed the narrative in a way that resonated with me, which is, and something I knew intuitively. I've participated in the industry in various indirect ways over the years and have observed it. In the pursuit of blade length, i.e. efficiency,
Right.
They have overlooked the balance of stresses that such long blades induce in the gearboxes and the stems and the materials of construction. And in the rush to offshore, they perhaps have underestimated the impact of the environment on these structures and how quickly erosion and pick your favorite. Everybody knows that operating in a saltwater environment is not conducive to structural integrity.
Did no one ever brief them on that this salt thing is kind of a bad environment to operate in? That's the part that leaves me gobsmacked. Is like,
so when you're an executive who owns equity and options and you have quarterly pressures to show growth, and you could sell, exercise those options and generate a large personal wealth if you hit your numbers, and your share price, like Siemens Energy did, collapses when you finally come clean. It is our observed experience, having been executives at various publicly traded companies, that the desire to come clean doesn't get any stronger as the problem grows. And so, is this the quarter you want to come clean? Now let's do it next quarter, right?
There's a correlation between the coming clean and the closing and the approaching date of retirement or whatever.
And that only gets worse, right? And so what we view the wind industry at a significant turning point, and we made a call in that presentation that we could see a rapid unraveling of wind as a viable renewable energy option in the next 3 to 5 years. We view all of those installed turbines
from your lips to God's ears. Let me just say that, because I'm working on another piece on the wind business that I'm going to have out very soon on the backlash that is not constrained to the United States, but I won't any more than that.
Let's talk financial backlash. Every single installed turbine is a stationary giant liability to the equity holders of those that have installed them. There's reps and warranties, as we would say, as to performance levels. And on top of that, the great lie of levelized cost of electricity has led to governments contracting with the producers of wind power for electricity rates that are far below what those producers would need to earn their cost of capital. And, in the long run, that which can't go on forever usually doesn't.
Right.
And we're already seeing major developers walk away from fixed payment contracts and just breaking up the contract, paying the fee and washing their hand of it, as opposed to making a bad situation even worse. And we have convinced a generation of politicians and administrators that wind is the cheapest energy source available, when in reality, corrected for how we actually use electricity, it's amongst the most expensive. And you have to square that peg eventually.
Yeah. So again, we've been talking for more than an hour now. So, I always ask the same questions because I'm always interested in these answers. What are you reading these days?
So Neil Howe has a follow-up to his great book, The Fourth Turning, that he has just published. And so I am reading his first book because I never read it. And I don't like to read the sequel before reading the original. So I am now, well, let's put it this way. The book, The Fourth Turning, is on my night table. Given the publication cadence that we have, publishing 6 to 8 pieces a month. Not sure that I'll get a chance to get past the first few chapters, but that is the book that is currently on my night table.
The Fourth Turning.
Yes.
Okay. Anything else you want to recommend, or you leave it at that?
I would highly recommend this really great Substack called robertbryce.substack.com. The guy just is a machine, puts out amazing stuff. I've yet to read a piece that I disagree with, and really great guy too, if you ever get to know him. So I would highly recommend robertbryce.substack.com.
The check is in the mail, Doomberg. The check in the mail to Green Chicken Post Office Box somewhere. What gives you hope? I mean, you doom scrolled, I've said this many times, and I turned 63 last month, and in my lifetime, since I was a kid, maybe during the threat of nuclear war, I don't know a time that's more uncertain that I've experienced myself, right? A time of more kind of uncertainty in financial markets, political kind of schisms in American politics, schisms in, in society. And it's worrisome. What gives you hope?
We've been closer to the abyss than we are now before, and we've come back from it. It's kind of a Pascal's wager situation. And I would say what gives me hope is outside of Germany, the global renaissance of nuclear power. If you and I had spoken 18 months ago, and maybe we did, where we are today versus where we were back then, and then what that means for projecting forward is truly remarkable. I do think that once we get past this generation of leaders that are no longer, cognitively lucid, that we might end up with a new slate of politicians that has a different view of things. It's time for this generation of leaders to pass the baton to those that are coming up. And I'm obviously bullish America, bullish the U.S., bullish capitalism. I'm a patriotic participant in the U.S. capital system, and love my kids enough to try to do our part to leave them in better hands than we found it. And ultimately, there's enough good people in the country and with good intentions, and even those who disagree with each other can do so civilly and constructively and with compromise. And so in the long term, I think this too shall pass. I think we will see peace in Russia and Ukraine, and hopefully we'll avoid war over Taiwan, and we'll get smart about our energy policies, and we'll become less flippant about wasting taxpayer money on various boondoggles. And, if you look at Ontario and that piece that we wrote, cheat codes, it is possible. The public can vote and new leaders can come in and they can reconcile with physics and good things can happen. And let's hope and pray that happens here post haste.
That's a good place to stop. My guest has been Doomberg, your favorite green chicken, my favorite green chicken. You can find him on Substack, of course, doomberg.substack.com. You won't find him on Twitter, by the way. He's done with that. He has washed his wings of Twitter. Doomberg, always a pleasure catching up with you. Good luck on Notes. I will be looking for you on Notes on Substack. And to all of you out there in podcast land, thanks for tuning into this episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. Make sure to tune in. Next week, we will have another guest who won't be a green chicken. Until then, see ya.